Thanks, Tiffany. Kia ora and welcome to this Manaaki Whenua LINKOnline Webinar. Today we're talking about trees, afforestation and regeneration. At Manaaki Whenua we do lots of tree research, particularly but not exclusively, focusing on our native species and the benefits they provide across the landscape. This seminar brings together two key areas of expertise at Manaaki Whenua, economics and social research, reflecting that we humans, or in this case, landowners and land managers, are the biggest actors in the environment. Peter Edwards is an environmental social scientist and Maxim Polyakov is a senior economist. Both have a special interest and background in trees and forests. I'll be back at the end to help with your questions, so don't forget to put them in the chat box as soon as you can. Over to you now, Peter.
Great, thank you, Christine. Welcome. So yes, Maxim and I were part of a team that was looking at the barriers and opportunities around planting native trees on farms. If you pop to the next slide there, Maxim. So this work was commissioned by Ministry for Primary Industries through their Greenhouse Gas Inventory Fund, and they were looking for essentially to find out what sort of barriers and what the potential opportunities and strategies to promote native afforestation on farms was. We've got a relatively good understanding of the land suitability around for afforestation, particularly production forestry, but there's really a limited knowledge about the barriers to plant native trees on farms and the factors that influence rural landholders to plant these native trees. So we started out looking, kind of categorizing the barriers that we found through a systematic review of the literature, and started out with what we and MPI termed the system barriers. In particular, we broke some of these down to more general system barriers, but also particular system barriers that Maori were facing. So with Maori, there was a number of issues, particularly around the logistics of getting multiple owners, sometimes in the thousands of owners, to meet and or agree with how the land was to be used. A number of issues around Maori land and permanent alteration, so having to go through a number of processes with the Maori land court to get permission to do those permanent alterations. With the multiple ownership question, there's been some difficulty for Maori to secure financing through regular banking channels, so they aren't able to raise the capital necessary to start that process. And the third, I guess, sort of the final major barrier that Maori faced was around Te Ao Maori and their worldview, where greenhouse gases and carbon sequestration didn't actually fit within Te Ao Maori, so a number of considerations there. Onto the more general system barriers, we broke these down into sort of three categories. So there's a number of biophysical barriers that we found. So some areas, despite sort of our knowledge that there is a huge amount of land available for planting native trees, there are areas that just simply aren't suitable for native trees or for particular species. The increasing frequency of storms and sort of pest or predator infestations were also barriers to planting those trees. So not knowing how a lot of our native trees would react or survive with those storms and other climatic events. There were a number of social and regulatory barriers, tying in with some work that we previously did for the 1 Billion Trees Partnerships Program, the community perceptions around forestry and forests, whether particularly native forests, sometimes was not particularly positive. So sort of those narratives and perceptions that the community have can also hold landowners back. There's also a lack of sort of policies around specifically aimed at the use of native forests and native trees. So being able to plant them and how they can manage them or do what they want to do with them later on was also sort of a hindrance. One of the large, actually quite large aspects, kind of from the more the social aspect, is that there's a significant lack of information on how to grow these native trees. How to once they get them in the ground, how do they actually keep them alive long enough so that they can actually survive and flourish on their own? And kind of related particularly to the carbon sequestration question. In the ETS lookup tables, there's a single entry for native trees, which was based on Manuka scrub. So the actual carbon sequestration rates that are published, not indicative or really relevant to any of the other native trees. So previously, there's been a number of models that have tried to look at how our native trees sequester carbon, but those models were not particularly reliable for native trees. And I'll sort of mention that Tane's Tree Trust has done a bunch of work over the last few years that shows some of the early carbon sequestration rates for our native trees. And kind of following with that lack of information idea is that there's, when landowners want to plant these trees, when they plant them, there's actually not a lot of support out there to keep them growing and surviving. Some of the sort of from the survey of rural decision makers, we looked at a number of the reasons why landholders were not going to plant trees in the next couple of years, and a lot of them, the majority of them actually found that they had better uses for the land. And when we delved into that in a bit more detail within our 1 Billion Trees program, as well as some of the literature that's emerged, that farmers are quite interested in planting trees, but generally often for sort of amenity purposes or as shelter belts, so not necessarily taking up large tracts of land. I'll just hop onto the next one. Another category that we developed with MPI was around nurseries. And based on some of the literature and a survey that was done by the New Zealand Plant Producers Industry Association, was that nurseries, particularly around natives, have a lot of difficulty being able to upscale. So nurseries need kind of space, the time and labor to be able to do that, and not a lot of the particularly small nurseries, which makes up the vast majority of nurseries in New Zealand, actually have that space to upscale. The kind of whole idea of forward orders, so they need to have a continuous knowing that they're going to have orders coming in for the foreseeable future, is one sort of I guess condition that they would want to have in place before they're considering upscaling. And to get a native tree from seed, it takes anywhere from 1 to 4 years to get one that's able to be planted out in the wild. And again, most of the increase in native nursery growth hasn't actually been around trees. It's been with shrubs, grasses, and flax to mainly take up the idea of the riparian planting. We next looked at financial barriers, and I guess financial barriers were one of the main, one of the key barriers to people planting. There was a lot of lack of information around the costs, the benefits, and the value to planting other systems. And along with sort of that earlier with Maori, that access to capital, they were unable to, not necessarily always able to access that capital. Farmers also had concerns around being able to change back to farming from forestry, and once they had taken out the farming infrastructure and put in forestry, it was an extremely high cost to go back to farming. The establishment of native forests even on marginal land, most of that land is hilly and quite remote, so the Climate Change Commission had estimated that there were over 300,000 hectares that could be established as native forests, but their estimate of cost was in the neighborhood of between $5 and $15 billion. So that certainly puts a damper on farmers' interest in doing that. And again, for carbon sequestration, the return on investment has quite a high time span. It can be up to 70 years before they'd start to get any sort of return on their investment, although it does get lower, down around 15 years for regenerated forests. Next slide. Then there were a number of labor and kind of individual barriers that landholders reported, so around the sort of a skills deficit for both landholders and for the workforce that were able to available. So very few of them actually had any knowledge of how to sort of maintain or plant new native forest systems. Communities were an issue with the labor, particularly around rates of pay. And there's been some work done that shows carbon farming actually results in low number of jobs, so 0.6 of an FTE per 1,000 hectares, whereas farming has a relatively higher number of jobs. The other aspect was a lack of work within their own communities, so the transient nature of those jobs. Individual contexts and their own situation played quite heavily into whether they were going to decide around planting. So sort of farmers' age, their education, their knowledge, experience, attitudes to risk and change, and just simply their personal preferences played quite a role. Kind of coming back to the survey of rural decision makers, we can see that of the respondents, about just over 50% of those decided that it indicated that it was a lifestyle sort of personal decision that was their primary reason for not changing land use towards forestry, and the others were relatively lower. Next slide. Touched on this a little bit earlier, so the whole idea of the availability of information around native trees. So the focus has been establishing establishing new forests. However, there isn't, in one respect, much information around enrichment restoration. So actually starting to plant more trees within existing remnant forests that may be degraded. Again, there's that limit of knowledge on establishing new native forests and uncertainty around the markets. And there's an existing interest primarily around planting natives for aesthetic and amenity purposes rather than sort of large scale. So it wasn't all sort of, I suppose, doom and gloom around the barriers. There are actually quite a few opportunities. So the general opportunities that we found existed going forward around native trees were around improving the research, understanding how small patches of native trees would grow and sequester carbon, being able to sort of change those narratives, kind of negative narratives around trees on farms. So often farmers don't like the idea of trees on their farms, and taking advantage of a number of existing programs, particularly at the regional council or catchment groups, to facilitate the planting and maintenance of those seedlings. And then some ideas around how nurseries might be able to scale up, or if they couldn't, ways that we could get a lot more native seedlings growing. And then finally, I'll touch on the financial opportunities. So within the ETS and sort of other schemes, there's actually very little sort of consideration of ecosystem services that can also bring kind of financial benefits to landholders. There's a lack of sort of innovative financing mechanisms such as environmental impact bonds, continuous cover forestry type funds or green bonds, climate risk adjusted loans or community funding. So there's opportunities to explore new financing mechanisms. The other big thing with financial opportunities is simply the simplification of any application process where that would reduce the transaction costs for landowners. And so being able to reduce a number of those costs would also encourage landowners to do it. And so I'll turn it over to Maxim now for the next part.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So the second half of this presentation is about our empirical study, which is a choice experiment study aimed to quantify trade-off between different elements of incentive programs to encourage native afforestation and regeneration. So you looked at both how does factors characteristics of the programs and hypothetical programs and characteristical properties impact participation in native tree establishment and the area which landholders would be willing to commit to native forest establishment. So this is choice experiment, which is basically a series of the respondent of the survey asked to make series of hypothetical choices about whether they would choose one option or another, and option has different set of characteristics. In this case, we'd ask whether they would be participating in a hypothetical incentive program to encourage to plant or establish trees. So the survey started from some background information and explanation of cost benefits of native trees on the property. Specifically, we explained how much of the carbon credit can get they from this program, and we followed with a set of 8 choice cards, and each choice card presented features of the one or another hypothetical program. Each program had 6 attributes. One attribute would be whether this reversion or regeneration or afforestation. Reversion would be natural regeneration, afforestation would be planting. Another feature would be characteristics of the non-monetary kind of incentive, whether there is any support to selecting species and planning, whether landholder in charge of that or government will help. Next one, whether government will help with finding labor or not. And next one would be whether government will help with providing seedlings. So, and 3 options are landholder would be in charge of finding seedlings, government will help find supplier, and government will provide seedlings. And in all of those three cases, government would pay for seedlings. And now, final non-monetary attribute would be whether government will help to fill out paperwork for participation and for ETS, or landholder will be in charge of that. And there is one monetary attribute, the grant which landholder gets for participating in the program, which is dollars per hectare. And the range of these grants would be from $0 to $12,000. So each participant would respond 8 of these choice cards and select yes or no, and they have different mix of these attributes. And if they select yes, we would also ask how much would they commit to this native forest establishment. And after they answer this question, they would ask some questions about why. For example, why would they participate or why not, and where would they plant or establish trees, and also some features of the property. What is the size? Was it the program marginal land? So this is a structure of this choice experiment, and we used a survey of rural decision makers panel. So survey of rural decision makers is a survey which is conducted by the Manaki Whenua every 2 years, and some of the respondents are willing to participate in some follow-up surveys. So we selected those which have property size greater than 5 hectares, who are dairy farmers, so sheep, beef, and other livestock, and also lifestyle block owners. So we saw that these are potentially would be participating in those establishing trees on the properties, basically. We administered this survey in June 2022 and got sent 2,258 invitations and got 609 usable responses and analyzed these results. So because we asked whether respondents would participate and also what the area they would commit if they would participate. So this is kind of two-step decision. So we use this hurdle negative binomial model, which able to model these things in the same time. So other nuance is that we have one of the attributes of the programs was whether there is planting of trees or native regeneration. That's what MPI was interested in. And we kind of noticed that decision about those two types of forest establishment are different. So we model them as separate models. So, and I will not show result of the estimation. I'll show just some effects, predicted effects of most important features of the program and most important features of the property on probability of participation and area enrolled, area committed to the native forest establishment. So, and this need to be done for the, because it depends on many factors. I will be talking about these effects for typical farm, which is 377 hectares and average or rolling hill topography, and unless I would say otherwise, an average proportion of marginal land, and for programs that has average grant amount, which is $4,200 and no non-monetary benefits, unless I will say otherwise. And for this type of farm or property, for the afforestation or planting, which is artificial planting, probability of participation would be 17%, and average farmer with on 377 hectare farm would commit 26 hectares. And for natural regeneration, probability is 25%, and area would be 9 hectares. So which I'll talk about features of the program, and most important features of the program out of those in the choice card are grant, monetary incentive, and the help with the seedlings. So in this chart, on the left-hand side, you see this result for afforestation or planting, and on the right-hand side would be for reversion or natural regeneration. And on the x-axis, you would see grant amount from $0 to $12,000, and on x-axis, on y-axis, you have probability of enrollment. And different colors of the lines would be how landholders help with seedlings, and blue is landholders find seedlings by themselves, green government helps find provider, and yellow government provides seedlings. You can see that first of all, the bigger grant is a higher probability of participation. It changes from, if no help is seedling, from 0 almost to like 40% for $12,000, and for 0 or maybe 5 to maybe 50% for reversion. But also that help with seedling is substantially increases the probability of participation, almost doubles for the artificial, and maybe by 50% increases for reversion. Next set of graphs would be same thing, but that instead of probability of participation, I would show the area committed to the native tree establishment, again for 377 hectare farms on rolling hills. You can see that help with seedlings doesn't make difference for the area enrolled, but it has a little bit impact on the area. But the money or grant amount has a little impact on the area. For example, for the planting or afforestation, for this type of farm, the area committed would be changes from 15 to 20 hectares, and for reversion from 6 to 8 hectares. So not much, but have some impact. Okay, so this is about characteristics of the programs, and the next set of slides would be how do features of the farm or characteristics of the farm or property impact probability of enrollment and area committed. So the most important features or characteristics of the farm would be property size and the topography. So property size on the x-axis, topography would be blue, mostly flat, green would be rolling, and yellow would be steep. And you can see that, and then on x-axis we have probability of enrollment again. And for the planting, topography almost doesn't make any difference. And for the reversion or natural topography make large difference. But the property size does make difference for the probability of enrollment. So this is, again, same two characteristics, which is property size and the topography. And in this case, on x-axis, we have area committed to the program, to the native tree planting. You can see that with both topography and property size increase, which make difference for the area committed. So bigger property size, bigger area is committed, obviously. And the topography on steep topography, you have bigger area committed. Okay, we can look at this graph differently. Instead of area committed, it would be on x-axis. On a y-axis, I put proportion of farms committed to the planting when enrolled. And you can see that proportion of farm is small for the large, despite like the area, large farm enroll bigger area. As a proportion of farm, this is smaller. So, for example, for this. For flat topography, for this type, for $1,000 grant per hectare on 10-hectare farm, landowner would commit 50% of farm to native tree establishment, but on the 1,500-hectare farm, it's only 3%. So, in conclusions, monetary incentives are important to increase enrollment and area committed to both types of programs. Seedlings is most important factor. Help with application, paperwork, and help with is important, but not as much, and labor doesn't make difference. And property characteristics are also important for the enrollment and area committed to the program. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter and Maxim. That was a really rounded description of this report. You'll be pleased to know that in the follow-up email from this webinar, we will link to the report on the MPI website that may answer some of the questions that we've had. And more than ever before, we've had great kind of chat and exchange of ideas in the questions box. Rest assured, we will come back to all of those topics and publish those answers to the questions alongside the presentation on our website in a week or so's time. So I think we're running a little bit short of time today to really tackle some of these quite complex questions that you've all asked. So all I'm going to do is say thank you very much for those questions. They have given us plenty to think about. It reflects some research that's going on at Manaki Whenua beyond this particular program. So we'll ask some of our colleagues to help us answer those questions for you. And we look forward to seeing you again next month. We'll have a webinar about one of our major research programs, which also looks at how farmers and landowners are tackling the environment. Thanks again to Peter and Maxim, and thank you all for being with us today. Bye for now.